Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. This one's going to be a little thick. So, all right, put on your economics hats and let's have a ride here. On Friday, the Congressional Budget Office responded to a request I made in my capacity as chairman of the Joint Economic Committee. And what I was trying to get was an answer of were my projections, actually the economists' projections from the Joint Economic Committee, were they correct? Because you got to understand, there's actually a weird little battle going on here between the Senate and those of us in the House and those of us on Ways and Means. A number of our brothers and sisters over in this House of Lords have decided that, hey, we have current tax policy from 2017, TCJA, the tax reform, which I was on the committee. I was one of the people that helped author that. But they expire at the end of this year. And they want to play this game of saying, hey, we're just going to pretend that there's no cost, that the law is not the law, the policy is the law. So this is when you hear people say, current policy baseline, just do it. And we've been trying to do the math of saying, all right, Congressional Budget Office, a couple months ago, you actually did a projection saying that if we want to maximize economic growth over the next 10 years, what you do is you extend those tax cuts, but you pay for them. And the basic idea of that is by paying for them, you don't have government gobbling up the capital stack that's used to finance growth, to finance business, finance when you want to buy a truck or a new home or your business wants to expand. So we got an updated letter from the Congressional Budget Office. And apparently it didn't make me particularly popular with a few people, which that actually provides me a perverse joy. But if you read it, in the 30-year window, it looks like if we do all this without an attempt to pay rates by 1%, in the 30-year window, it looks like you break CBO's budgetary model because you hit 250% of debt to GDP. And if I'm reading one of the paragraphs here correctly, they're basically saying, hey, our computer model doesn't go beyond 250%. But the point is, you have a government that here's our baseline. Let's see if I can make this make sense. At the end of this fiscal year, $37 trillion, $200 billion is going to be the country's debt. Over the next 10 years, we're expected to borrow an additional $22 trillion. On top of that, if you play with these folks that say we don't really need to pay for things, just keep it going, that's about another $5.5 billion, probably another 5.5 trillion, another 1.3 trillion in interest. And then if we were to be able to make the president's wish list without finding offsets or modernizations, and I'm going to walk through a whole series of things where it's not cuts, it's modernization, legalizing the technology that disrupts the cost, that makes our society better, happier, more efficient. But if you were to do all those things without an attempt to pay for them, without an attempt to adopt policy to modernize the way we deliver services, the previous 240 years, we borrowed about $28 trillion from the public. That's investors around the world, from your pension system, from everything. It would mean over the next 10 years, we pretty much double. So 240 years, we're going to double it, or come close to doubling it in the next 10 years. That is the perversity of what you have going on around here. Yet the people coming behind these microphones keep having a wish list and want more stuff and more stuff and more stuff. The people walking through our hallways here are in our offices demanding more stuff. They either want more carve-outs in the tax code, they want barriers to entry to their competition, or they just want another check. And I'm going to walk you through just how dangerous a game we're playing right now. Because when you look at these charts, and this is online, just go on CBO from last Friday and read it for yourself. It's not a hard read. Why are my brothers and sisters so terrified to tell the truth to the public? You have a country that, and I'm going to show the charts, that in about 7.5 years, we have more deaths than births. You have a country that when we get out of the extraordinary measures, remember right now we're borrowing from our different funds because we're up against the debt ceiling. We may be borrowing almost $70,000 every second of every day. For those of you who turn to me and say, David, I demand you balance the budget, I can do it tomorrow. Let's see, if I use the 2024 numbers, for every dollar we took in tax collections, we spent $1.39. Tell me the 39 cents of government you want me to cut. And their problem with that math is when you look at the charts, do you see what's in blue? That's everything a member of Congress gets to vote on, defense and non-defense. Your only problem is it's 26% of the spending. So if you ask a member of Congress right now, balance the budget, we can do it. We can do it. Got to get rid of all defense, all non-defense discretionary. That's basically the Park Service, the EPA, all the agencies. And then tell me what portion, because you got to pay your interest, or you blow up the world economy. Tell me what portion of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the other things you want to hack away at. The reality of it is, in this fiscal year, our projection is up till the recent, now we're starting to downgrade our growth, is for every dollar we take in tax collections, we're going to spend functionally $1.36. Do you understand how screwed, actually it's a technical economic term, how screwed we are when we don't tell the truth about the math? And it is not fixable, but it is possible to stabilize. We can stabilize this. We just have to think and do things that are hard. And so often around here, the thinking part is complex and it's hard, and we have to go home and tell our constituents the truth about math. But remember, the math will win. So how many of you have heard about, hey, we have people out protesting. They're terrified there's going to be cuts. Okay, let's actually have a moment of truth about math. This was baseline. Over the next 10 years, we were going to spend $86 trillion. Next 10 years, CBO baseline, we're going to spend $86 trillion. The reconciliation budget had what, 1.3 trillion in cuts, and if we got lucky and did everything, you might get to 2. So we're talking about 2 trillion of cuts over 10 years on 86 trillion of spending. That's what the left over here is losing their minds over, because they need something. You know, they've lost the working middle class. They've lost so much of American voters, no longer trust them because they've spent decades, not telling them the truth about the math. Look, and it's not hard. Except the problem is 30% of that's borrowed. 30% of that's borrowed. And people are losing their mind that we're trying to cut $2 trillion on 86 trillion of spending. That's what this place has become. This place has become a clown show of math. Sorry, I hope not to hit you with those. Once again, I need to disclose, I've had a stunning amount of coffee today, so forgive me if I'm a bit cranky. We were trying to do projections of what our interest coverage would be this year. Now remember, let's see if I can make this make sense. How many of you saw just what was that, Thursday, Friday, the Federal Reserve actually lowered economic growth for this year and functionally for the next 3 years. They lowered us down to 1.7, I think. Just that lowering, if you do the math on the back of an envelope, it's not that hard. It's just a little less than $200 billion of loss of tax receipts. If you plug that into our committed spending, it basically means what we're going to have to borrow. You may have interest this year of 1.1 trillion and a borrow this year when the economy is fairly good of 2.2 trillion. One of my folks has a number, it's up to 2.3, but let's stick with the 2.2 trillion of borrowing in a year when the economy is good. So think about this. We're functionally going to spend about $7 trillion this fiscal year. We're going to take in about $5 trillion. And this is in a time when the economy is good. We're not in a pandemic, we're not in a war, we're not in a recession. And understand, when you take some of these charts of interest exposure into the future, there's one of my charts that shows in 9 budget years, interest, just interest, is over $2 trillion a year. Just interest. Why aren't we running around terrified here? I mean, if you care about your retirement, or someone that's crazy like my wife and I, we're older parents. I have a 2.5-year-old and a 9-year-old. You do realize for my 2.5-year-old, when he turns like 24, 23, 25, every tax in the United States has to have been doubled just to maintain baseline services. This is the morality of this place. And look, the last slide I'm going to pound on just, it's called interest fragility. We had Ray Dalio in one of our offices, and those of you who don't know him, please look him up. You know, Bridgewater's CEO, founder. I think he's now stepped down from that, but the biggest hedge fund in America, happens to have 50 years of being one of the hyper experts on interest rate markets and debt markets, saying, you guys are screwed. You guys have a real interesting problem. The United States and other countries are binging on debt. The United States borrows about 40% of all the world capital that goes into sovereign loans. His argument is, your problem is there's not enough savings in the world. We are consuming more money, us, China, Europe. Now Germany's going into the debt markets as they're raising their spending caps. What happens in a world when there's a shortage of borrowable money? Remember, every day when we borrow, $6 billion a day, functionally, that debt has to be sold. Most of it's actually financed domestically. You know, it's in this pension, it's in this bank, it's this, and then foreigners, except the foreigners have been lowering their U.S. debt because they're having to finance their own governments. And you start to look at our interest payments, and there's this concept called a term premium. When we make the bond markets nervous, we pay higher interest rates. So the clown show it will go around and say, well, let's just not pay our debts. Hey, we're up against the debt ceiling. Let's just not raise it. Okay. Yeah, fine. I mean, I enjoy your decade of world depression, because when you collapse the U.S. currency, you also collapse the world. Stability is our goal. Stability is how you minimize interest rates. And if you're financing 37 trillion and another 22 trillion, plus whatever else we're going to stack on top of that over the next decade, you really want the debt markets to think we're acting like adults. Because in many ways, when you look at these charts and you see about our interest coverage and how fragile we are, the bond market basically may be the greatest influence on this government. Though, how many people have you seen come behind these microphones ever talk about debt? And yet, the one thing we're not allowed to tell our voters, our public, our staff, each other, is the truth. What drives debt? Over the next 10 years, almost 100% of U.S. sovereign debt issue will be to cover interest and Medicare. In 7.5, let's call it 8 years, the Social Security Trust Fund is empty. And that first year, we have to make a decision. Are we going to let poverty of seniors double when they get a 21% cut in their checks? Or how much are we going to raise taxes? Are we actually going to do something complex of fix the system and make all the adjustments and those things? Except the moment you actually talk about saving Social Security, they have a consultant on their side, on the Democrat side, writing an attack ad because they care so much more about winning the next election than the morality of not doubling senior poverty. And the brain trust that runs around says, oh, just raise the cap. Okay. Except you just covered 38% of the shortfall. What do you want to do with the rest? 38% of the shortfall is our math, meaning that first year, so if the trust fund of Social Security is empty on 2033, 2034, the full year, 608 billion was our estimate on that first year. Think about that. Think about that scale. And then you hold up a chart like this. This is CBO's number of the next 30 years. Non-defense and defense discretionary actually have a positive balance, meaning they grow slower than tax receipts. Medicare, Social Security create 124 trillion of debt during that 30 years. It's not Democrat, it's not Republican, it's just demographics. We have a saying in our office, debt deficits and demographics. Deal with the facts, deal with the math, tell the truth. Except this place has been so busy spinning stories. As we were listening to Democrats a few minutes ago tell stories. Oh, we got to have there's an enemy out there. No. These things we can fix it. We can stabilize it. But somebody cares so much more about winning the next election. And you look at the next 10 years, is the point I'm trying to make, is, okay, here's the growth. 24% of the growth in spending over the next 10 years is interest. 31% of the growth of spending over the next 10 years is Social Security and disability. 28% of the growth of spending over the next 10 years is Medicare. Other mandatory and discretionary grows about 13%, but a portion of that is actually, you think, defense and other things in that. The fact of the matter is your government is an insurance company with an army. And now, the other part that makes doing the math so incredibly difficult. Every year, there are fewer workers or working age people to support our older population. This really seems to upset people, but understand, look at our fertility, look at our demographic charts, go back to 1990, the year we started to roll over. There's a data set out there, I don't believe it yet, I haven't had the chance to try to prove it, saying even last year we may have had more deaths than births. Okay. You want us to finance pay-as-you-go systems, which is Social Security and Medicare, at a time when we have a shortage of young people. There's a way to make it work. Are you going to allow people like me, to people who are here willing to think, to refine the process, to modernize? Look, we'll try to touch on this if I have time. Here's the MedPAC report from last week. Whole bunch of apparently really smart people examined Medicare and and walked up and down through the growth in spending and what we could do to modernize it and use technology to stabilize the prices. On some things, particularly on Medicare Advantage, they have hundreds of billions of dollars in here that wouldn't require cutting any service, any access to health care. It's just using technology and modernizing. But you got to understand, when we start to look at a chart like this, we're functionally here at, let's call it 2024. We have 2.9 people working, or excuse me, 2.9 in the population. There's another chart that's going to scare you even more. For every one person receiving benefits. And then you see it gets down to 2 people in society. I'm going to bounce around just a little bit on some of these. When you actually look at the Social Security trustees' data, something's happening out there where some of these numbers may be much worse than we expected. Because it turns out people actually are taking retirement earlier than we expected. Meaning the participation in the labor force is actually starting to get soft on the high-skilled populations, higher-income populations. We actually now, this one, we had a debate how upset this would make people. So here we are. We're going to start the 2026 budget year. We're actually supposed to be working on that budget. Without immigration, working-age people will start to disappear from the labor force. And you go, huh? Huh? Basically, 2026 is the last year where the age population is functionally stable. Then the next year, you start to actually fall in your number of working age people in the population. It's demographics. It's not Republican or Democrat, it's just math. One more chart of this, and then I'm going to give you the one that scares me the most. This is Social Security and disability benefits. Here we functionally are, let's get about where we are. So right now, if you add both those programs together, you have 2.67 workers for every beneficiary. At one point, it gets all the way down to just a little over 2 people working for every beneficiary. But if you actually do the big chart, how many people are actually in the labor force compared to how many people receiving benefits? And remember, I'm not talking about changing people's benefits. I'm talking about dealing with the reality of our demographics and ways we can differ, particularly when we start talking about health care. But let's take a look at 2023. We functionally, for every 100 people receiving benefits, we functionally had, for every 100 people we had working in America, we probably had 36, 37 people receiving benefits. Because remember, the whole concept of labor force participation. I've done presentations here about functionally the 7 million was my old number of prime-age males that are missing from the labor force. What do we do as a society to make it possible to encourage our brothers and sisters who are not working to actually get into the labor force? And yet my colleagues on the left, oh, you're going to have work requirements. You can't do that. If you don't do it, tell me how I make these numbers actually work. So, that's some of the miserable stuff. Let's actually sort of walk through, how do I make it work? Okay, I've come here and done a presentation showing that if this is our demographics, we're going to have to be willing to have a brutally honest conversation. Let me walk through a concept. Back in the 70s and 80s, what was the world conflict? It was for hydrocarbons, oil. Previous decade, much of the world conflicts were rare earths. I will argue we're in the decade right now. The conflict is for smart people, people with skill sets. Yet the United States has barely shown up for the battle. When you hear President Trump talk about the insanity that we educate people, we send them home to compete with us, the president's absolutely right. We have a whole presentation we've done here showing a talent-based, a STEM-based immigration system turns out to be remarkably beneficial for tax receipts, for economic growth, and for prosperity. Turns out you need that as one of an entire unified theory of things to do. But I want to walk through just a handful of quirky things. So when you hear people talk about Doge and how much upset they are, one of the primary things that's being discussed is the United States has a handful of huge databases. The problem is they don't talk to each other. So you saw the story last week of, hey, we just looked at some of the Social Security death files. Oldest person in America is what, 114 years old? So we took people over 114 years old and then wondered how they were getting loans at the Small Business Administration. And forgive my math, I'm doing this from memory from last week. It was like 3,300 people who were over 114 years old got SBA loans. $300 million of loans. Can you believe not a dollar's been paid back? If you actually start to have your data talk to each other, what would happen if it's a way to eliminate waste and fraud without an army of lawyers, without an army of auditors, without an army of bureaucracy? It turns out it's technology. Is that really that scary? Government already has the data. Why can't they bounce against each other saying, hey, this person's on the death file. Maybe they're not actually applying for a Small Business Administration loan. Yet, you see some of our Democrat colleagues, oh, waste and fraud, it doesn't really exist except for the billions of dollars we're identifying. So, let's walk through a couple other frustrating things. $42.5 billion provided for the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. Okay, now stick with me on this one. We have spent over $42.5 billion to get broadband to communities. Not a single community, not a single house has been connected to that broadband. But we spent $42 billion doing it. Between Christmas and New Year's, I took my little girl and we went out and hung out on the Navajo Reservation. If you're not from the Southwest, Navajo Reservation is immense. It's bigger than some states. And we chased around and we met with a number of people who said they were tired. They were tired of waiting, and they were going to wait another decade to get that wire, that fiber, whatever it was, to their chapter house, to their community, so they could have broadband. So they were doing something crazy. They were running down, ordering a satellite dish, and 48 hours later they had broadband. And then they were sharing it with Wi-Fi repeaters. And for a few $100s, they were fixing something that was going to take another decade and how many hundreds of millions of dollars. Think about adopting technology. Is the morality that we want to spend lots of money to actually subsidize these people who should be running wire? Or do we actually want these communities to be able to have telehealth, teleschools, telemonitoring of their lives to help them? Adopt the technology. Make it so you can actually use it, saying, we're never going to get that damn wire out to our rural community. Put up a satellite dish. Why does this scare people? It's because there's no good lobbyists running around here saying, hey, have you ever thought about doing this? It's archaic what we do. Another example, millions of taxpayers call the IRS for help. 2/3 don't get their phone answered. So think of this. The auditors of the IRS last year put out a report that only like 31% of the phone calls were getting answered at the IRS. So you're trying to fill out your tax forms. You're trying to give government money. And you call and call and call and call and call, and you can't get the phone answered. So what would happen? And so there was a little pilot program done, an experiment. Let's actually do a chat, like a chat GPT, that picks up the phone 24 hours a day, will stay on the phone as long as you need, will actually help you fill out your tax forms, will actually email you or text you the PDF of the form, maybe even send you the YouTube video on how to fill out the form. Why does this scare the hell out of I know, it's because the IRS is the second most unionized bureaucracy in the federal government. Turns out the union loses its mind when you talk about using technology to take care of the American people. Wouldn't you like to pick up the phone and call, whether it be the Social Security Administration, the IRS, and get your phone answered. How do I get my brothers and sisters here to help us adopt this technology? Look, and I have a handful of articles here using AI to functionally crash parts of the cost of delivering health care. Here's one about, actually making the environment much cleaner, much faster, much cheaper, and actually identifying bad acts with almost no bureaucracy. The ability to fix our logistics. We live in a time of miracles, and you actually start to look at when we start to say, just our baseline, just a couple of the pieces of legislation we have, we think we can get $100 billion a year just using technology in healthcare. How about another 150 billion? It's going to actually step into supply chains and these others. The adoption of technology, we can crash parts of the price of this government. Is that a cut? Is that a chainsaw? It's just doing things that aren't scary. Mr. Chairman, the last one I'll talk about is in the MedPAC report. The majority of Medicare recipients in America now use Medicare Advantage. And for those of us in the Scottsdale, Phoenix area, we actually have a much higher penetration. According to the report, and even when you do the adjustment of the portion of the population, it only takes the Medicare Part A, which is the hospital portion, which the trust fund, which also runs out in like 12, 13 years. It's 20% more expensive than fee-for-service. If you take it back to the fact that when Medicare Advantage was designed, it was supposed to come in at 95% of fee-for-service. Do that delta, that's approaching $100 billion a year. How about if, Mr. Speaker, we got together, and we've been working on this for months and months and months, said, hey, we need to align the incentives with the insurance providers, with the health care providers, with the person receiving the benefits, saying, how about if you make your profit by helping your population be healthier? A capitated model, or something of that nature, which actually I think the capitated model makes most sense, is here's our cost, and we make more money by helping our population be healthier than what's happening today, according to this report, saying we sign you up and then we spend lots of time and resources to score you as sicker and sicker and sicker because we get spiffs the sicker we score you. Is that a cut? I would actually, in today's world, when we know diabetes is 31% of all Medicare spending, let's get the incentives aligned so it cuts the cost, cuts the debt, but you end up with a healthier country. There are solutions here. The problem is it requires doing difficult things and thinking. I beg my brothers and sisters, let's go do the hard stuff. And if you have ideas, bring them to us. We're working our hearts out right now on everything from technology to audit the Pentagon, because we just had, our 8th or 9th year where the Pentagon was unauditable. Trying to design a talent-based immigration system that maximizes economic growth and tax receipts for the country. How about a saving Medicare Advantage for everyone that loves it, but in a way where it also maybe provides hundreds of billions of dollars of savings? We can do this. We can do this. We just have to do hard things. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to yield back to you.